All right, so are you ready to dive into some serious history? Like way back in the day history.
Oh, I love a good history deep dive. What are we digging into today?
Well, we're cracking open the Bible.
Okay, bold choice.
But before you think this is Sunday school, we're treating this like an archaeological dig.
I like where you're going with this. Less about faith, more about unearthing what these texts tell us about civilization.
Exactly. We're talking Genesis through Chronicles, looking for those cultural treasures hidden in plain sight.
Because there's a lot more there than people realize. These texts, they're not just religious documents, they're like foundational to Western thought.
Totally. I mean, law, literature, family dynamics, so much of it traces back to these stories.
It's like Western civilization's DNA right there in those pages.
Okay, so let's start at the very beginning. Genesis, the creation story. We've all heard it, but I'll be honest.
What's that?
It always felt kind of surface level to me. Like, what's the deeper meaning we often miss?
Oh, I hear you. It's easy to get stuck in the literal, right? What's fascinating about the Genesis creation story, unlike a lot of other creation myths, it really emphasizes humanity's unique role.
How so?
Well, we're not just here, we're created in God's image. And we're given this task, stewardship of the earth. That's a huge responsibility. Right from the start, it sets this idea that humans, we have the potential for incredible good and incredible destruction.
Which leads perfectly into Noah's Ark, not just a kid's story about cute animals, right?
No, definitely not.
This one always gave me the chills as a kid.
And rightfully so. Flood myths, they're everywhere. You find them across cultures. It speaks to this primal fear we have of nature's power. But in Genesis, the flood, it's not just about destruction. It's like a reset button for humanity.
Fresh start.
Exactly.
Yeah.
God makes a covenant with Noah, a promise for a new beginning. And this idea of a covenant, a binding agreement, it becomes crucial for everything that follows.
Right. And that covenant gets passed down to Abraham, arguably the most pivotal figure in this whole saga. Land, descendants beyond measure. Basically, his family becomes the chosen lineage.
Talk about pressure.
No kidding. I mean, does that tie into why land ownership is still such a hot-button issue even today? I mean, look at what's happening.
Absolutely. I mean, you can draw a direct line from the land promise to Abraham to the conflict between Israel and Palestine today, competing claims to that very same piece of earth. Wow. Each side believing they have the rightful claim based on these ancient texts. It just shows you these stories, however old they are, they still have this power to shape the world today.
It's like that saying, the more things change, the more they stay the same.
Right?
Speaking of things staying the same, can we talk about biblical families for a second?
Oh boy, here we go.
Because, let's be real, they were messy.
Understatement.
Jacob and Esau, Rachel and Leah. It's like reality TV drama, but with much higher stakes.
Way higher. Think about it. These aren't just sibling spats or jealous wives. These conflicts, they determined inheritance, power dynamics, even which lineage was considered favored by God. It all ties back to that original covenant, and it has huge implications for generations to come.
Wow, I never thought about it like that. So it's like every little squabble is magnified.
Exactly. Take Jacob, for example. Yeah, he's the younger son, but he's portrayed as more cunning, and he ultimately takes Esau's birthright, which makes you wonder, what did ancient cultures value more? Being the rightful heir? Or having that kind of ambition?
That's a good question. It's like, are leaders born or made? Is it better to be righteous or resourceful?
Exactly. These stories, they don't offer easy answers, but they definitely give you a lot to think about.
They do.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got creation, we've got this pivotal covenant, and some serious family drama. Where do things go from here? Because I've got a feeling this is just the beginning. So last time we left off, we had this chosen family, descended from Abraham, a lot of promises, but also a lot of baggage. Where does their story go next?
Well, let's just say things take a turn.
Oh, no. What, like, for the worst?
Yeah, not great. They end up in Egypt, and things go south pretty quickly.
Egypt. I always pictured them more in, like, desert landscapes.
Oh, they end up there too. But first, Egypt. And it's rough. We're talking enslavement, brutal treatment, the whole 9 yards.
Wow. Talk about a low point.
Yeah.
So much for that divine covenant protecting them, huh?
Right. It's a good reminder that even with a promise from on high, life can still throw some serious curveballs.
No kidding. Speaking of curveballs, this period of their history, it always felt almost mythical to me. Burning bushes, plagues, parting the Red Sea. Like, come on, is there any historical evidence to back up these epic events?
It's a question that's intrigued scholars for centuries. And to be honest, there's no like smoking gun,
Yeah.
no direct archaeological proof of those specific events.
But we're talking pure myth then.
Not necessarily. There are some historical records that suggest there was a Semitic presence in Egypt during this period, which, makes you wonder.
Wonder what?
How much of what we read is meant to be literal history and how much is metaphorical, maybe reflecting deeper truths about power, about faith, about, well, the human condition.
That's a really interesting way to look at it. It's like, even if we don't take every detail as a historical fact, these stories still tell us a lot about how ancient people understood the world and how they grappled with it. And speaking of grappling, escaping Egypt isn't exactly smooth sailing either, is it? Don't they wander the desert for 40 years?
40 years, yeah. Which symbolically represents a generation.
Okay, I was going to say that's a long time to be lost.
Right. But it's not just about being lost. It's this period of testing, of refining their identity as a people. They're not just escaping slavery, they're forming a new society with its own laws, rituals, beliefs. It's nation building from scratch with, a lot of trial and error along the way.
And all with the shadow of Mount Sinai looming over them. Those 10 commandments, talk about pressure.
Try being the guy who has to carve those in stone.
Oh, man. Can you imagine? Actually, that makes me think, were these laws set in stone back then? Or was there room for, I don't know, interpretation?
It's interesting you ask that, because even within the text, there are different interpretations of the law.
Really? So they couldn't even agree back then?
Right. You've got this strict adherence on one hand, and then more nuanced applications on the other. It's this whole debate, right? The spirit of the law versus the letter of the law.
Timeless.
Yeah.
Right. We're still having that same argument today.
Exactly. Some things never change.
Okay, so they've escaped. They've got their laws. They're starting to build a society. I'm guessing the next chapter is all about settling down, finally getting to that promised land.
You'd think so, right? But it's not as simple as just showing up and claiming their prize, this land. It's already inhabited. What follows is a period of conquest, led by figures like Joshua. And it's here that the narrative gets, how do I put this?
What, spill it?
Well, a bit morally complex.
Or complex how?
Well, the text doesn't shy away from the violence, the destruction involved in establishing their nation. We're talking battles, conquests, even accounts of, well, let's just say it wasn't pretty.
Wow, so it's not all sunshine and roses once they reach the promised land.
Yeah, definitely not. It's a good reminder that this idea of good versus evil, right versus wrong, it's not always so clear-cut, even in these ancient stories.
That's a really interesting point. It's like history is always more complicated than we think, especially when it's told by the victors.
Right, exactly. It's so important to consider different perspectives.
Okay, so they've conquered the land, but something tells me it's not all smooth sailing from there. What happens next?
So we've gone from creation to covenant to, well, conquest. But even after all that, it sounds like the Israelites, they still haven't found peace. Did they ever manage to settle down, or was it just constant turmoil from there on out?
Well, it's kind of both. I mean, the kingdom, it splits in two, right? You've got Israel in the north, Judah in the south.
Right. Two kingdoms. And how'd that work out for them? Not so great, honestly. They both faced their own internal struggles, external threats. And let's just say, sometimes their own leaders were their own worst enemies.
Oh, man. Talk about a recipe for disaster. It's like you finally get your own place, and then everything falls apart. Were there any bright spots at all during this period? Anyone trying to, get things back on track?
Oh, yeah, for sure. In Judah, you've got King Hezekiah. He's remembered as a reformer, someone who really tried to hit the reset button on their relationship with God.
So, good guy.
Yeah, he even tried to root out corruption in the government. But here's the thing. His own son, Manasseh, talk about a rebellious teenager.
What, did he, crash the chariot and blame it on the servants?
More like completely reverse all of Hezekiah's reforms. It's like he saw it as a power play, to break away from his father's legacy. Whatever the reason, he really undid a lot of the progress that had been made.
Wow, what a mess. So, Judah's got its own drama going on. What about Israel? Any hope up north?
Not really. They went through a string of kings, most of whom, let's just say they weren't exactly known for their piety. One particularly, shall we say, memorable couple was Ahab and his queen, Jezebel.
Jezebel. Now, there's a name you don't forget. What'd she do?
Well, she was all about promoting the worship of Baal.
Baal?
Yeah, a god from her homeland. Which was a big no-no, obviously, since the Israelites were supposed to be all about the one God. She's kind of seen as this Powerful, even ruthless figure. Some people see her as a villain, others as a strong woman defying the rules. But one thing's for sure, she shook things up.
Sounds like she kept things interesting, to say the least.
Yeah.
But with all this going on, all this religious and political turmoil, I'm guessing the prophets, they weren't exactly keeping quiet.
Oh, no, they were definitely speaking out. You've got figures like Elijah, Elisha. They were like the conscience of the people, challenging kings, performing miracles, constantly reminding everyone about that whole covenant with God, even when nobody wanted to hear it.
It's like they're saying, hello, remember us, chosen people, ringing any bells?
Exactly. But unfortunately, no one seemed to be listening. And both Israel and Judah, they eventually face the consequences. Israel gets conquered by the Assyrians, and their people are scattered.
So that's it for them.
Pretty much. Judah manages to hold on a bit longer, but they eventually fall to the Babylonians. It's this period of exile, destruction, a real low point in their history.
Talk about a gut punch. So what happens next? Is that it? Is this the end of the story?
Not quite. Even in exile, they clung to their faith, their identity, and the prophets, they kept talking about hope, about a future restoration, a return to their land.
Okay, a little glimmer of hope.
Right. And eventually, believe it or not, that's exactly what happens. The Persians conquer Babylon, and their leader, Cyrus the Great, he allows the exiled Jews to go back to Jerusalem.
Wow. So they get to rebuild.
They do. They get to rebuild their temple, start over. But of course, it's not that easy. Rebuilding a nation, well, that's never a walk in the park.
What kind of challenges did they face this time around?
Well, for one thing, the land they returned to, it's not the same when they left. Things have changed. New influences, new neighbors. It's like coming home after a long trip and realizing nothing's quite how you left it. They have to figure out how to adapt while also holding on to their traditions, their beliefs. And then just as they're getting settled...
What? Don't tell me another conqueror.
You guessed it. This time it's Alexander the Great, bringing Greek culture, philosophy, language, another wave of change to navigate.
This is exhausting. I need a nap.
Tell me about it. And then, of course, Alexander's empire falls apart, and guess who steps in?
Let me guess. The Romans. Everyone's favorite empire builders?
Exactly. And while things are relatively peaceful for a while, eventually tensions start to rise. Roman rule becomes more and more oppressive, and that leads to revolts, crackdowns. It's a very tumultuous period.
So, not exactly the peaceful ending we were all hoping for.
Sadly, no. But it does set the stage for a whole other chapter in this story.
A chapter we'll have to save for another deep dive, unfortunately. We've gone from the beginning of time to, well, the Roman Empire, all in one episode.
Time flies when you're talking about ancient history.
It really does. And, you know, I have to say, I've never thought about these biblical stories quite like this before. It's really made me see them in a whole new light.
That's what we were hoping for. These texts, they're not just religious stories. They're about power, faith, resilience. Themes that are still so relevant today.
Absolutely. So, for anyone listening, don't be afraid to dig a little deeper, ask questions, explore. You might be surprised what you find.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder these big questions and maybe even revisit these ancient stories with fresh eyes. Until next time.